Chapter 12 of Tractate Shabbos begins with a sequence of individual discussion and analysis on each of the 39 forms of work forbidden on Shabbos, the first of which to be discussed in the first Mishnah is that of building. The amount of building to make you liable is any amount, including chiseling the stone, striking the final blow with hammer or sledgehammer, or drilling. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel includes striking a hammer on an anvil as you're improving the work. The Gemara explains that any amount includes even very small things like digging a tiny hole to store coins, as the sewers in the tabernacle would also dig little holes to store their needles. Others say no, as that would rust the needles, so rather it's crafting a small stand for a stove, as by the tabernacle some would have little stands for their dye kettles. Others disagree and say it's to include sealing a small hole in your wall with clay, as was done by the tabernacle with molten lead. Some even say that positioning a stone in the ground makes you liable according to a source. The issue of chiseling is debated between one of building or striking the final blow. There's a similar debate by making a hole in a chicken coop, wedging a peg into the cavity of a hoe. We need to list all these cases to include a normal manner of building, an atypical one, and others. Some hold it's an issue of striking the final blow by chiseling, others disagree, it's discussed further. Included in this work is hollowing out 3/4 of a block, and the issue with the anvil, some say, is that you're training your hands. Some say it's just that was something done in the tabernacle to make sure the hammer is smooth, while pounding sheets of gold. New Mishnah, now on plowing. Plowing, any amount, weeding, pruning, dry branches, or young shoots. Again, any amount makes you liable. If you're gathering wood off a tree, if you're doing it to improve the tree, you're liable from any amount. If you're doing it to get some kindling wood, you're liable for the minimum amount of wood required to cook an easily cooked egg. The same applies to gathering grass. If it's to improve the soil, liable in any amount. If it's for fodder, liable in the amount of a kid's mouthful. The Gemara says you're liable in any amount of plowing to include the smallest amount, to plant one seed for a pumpkin, as that was something done by the tabernacle, to plant one stalk of herb for a dye. The other forms of garden work are also discussed. New Mishnah, now on writing. Writing two letters with either hand, two of the same letters or two different letters, with one or two inks in any language makes you liable. An opinion says the source from the tabernacle when they marked letters on the boards to know which ones went next to each other. Another adds that if you started writing a long word and then stop, and the first letters of the long word formed a word by themselves, then you're liable. The Gemara says that we're either discussing somebody ambidextrous, so the right and left hands can apply equally, or it's the view of the opinion that the issue with writing is the marking, which could be done with either hand. There's argument on the point of only writing two letters. This gets into a bit of a point on specificity when writing tefillin and mezuzah in regards to precision with letters so they don't resemble other letters. There's further points on the institution of certain letters and spelling of verses. It also describes why the letters are in their order and shaped as they are, each representing different concepts of proper behavior and practice. New Mishnah. If you write two letters in one lapse of awareness, you're liable once. This applies with most inks, be it ink, paint, red pigment, copper sulfate, or otherwise, even on two walls which meet at a corner, or on two separate tablets that you can bring together. You're also liable for writing on your skin. There's an argument about scratching letters into your skin. If you wrote using liquids, fruit juice, dust, or anything impermanent, you're exempt. You're also exempt if you write in an odd manner, like with the back of your hand, with your foot, mouth, or elbow, writing one letter next to a pre-existing writing, or over pre-existing writing. You're similarly exempt for intending to write the letter ches, which is made of two other letters, two zions, and accidentally writing those two. Also, if you wrote a letter on a ground and another on a beam, or two letters on two separate walls of a house, or on two separate ledgers that cannot be read together. So all those you're exempt. There's an argument if you write one letter as an abbreviation. The Gemara gives definition and explanation on a lot of these cases. Some say if you write one letter but it completes a book, you're liable, and the same applies to the last thread of a garment. If you write two letters in different cities, so the only action required is to bring them together, you're liable. If you intentionally turn a ches into two zions, you're liable. This is discussed further. It gives some examples of abbreviation using letters. Last mission of the chapter, if you write two letters in two lapses of awareness, once in the morning and once in the afternoon, there's an argument if you're liable or exempt. The Gemara explains that the basis for the argument is if you hold that you can become aware of half a measure in these actions. And that's the end of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Tractate Shabbos continues with elaboration on the various 39 forms of work forbidden on Shabbos. In regards to weaving 3 threads or adding one thread to a woven fabric makes you liable. The rabbis say it's 2 threads either initially or being added. Also, on a loom, you're liable for setting 2 heddle eyes. In a winnow, a fine sieve, a core sieve, a basket, or others, you're also liable. Finally, sewing 2 stitches or tearing in order to sew 2 stitches makes you liable. The Gemara says that the opinion that weaving threads is with 3 threads is where it's thick threads, which won't unravel. If it's thin, then it's an issue with 2. Some say it's the opposite, with thin threads by 3, where they're noticeable, and thick threads by 2. This is discussed further. It also describes the loom setup with the heddles on their frame. The Mishnah is repeating points about tearing stitches to teach some points that come up in the next Mishnah. Included in the point about tearing stitches to resew is where the garment is sewed unevenly, leaving lumpy folds that are torn to be smoothed out and resewed. New Mishnah. Further on tearing. Tearing due to anger or for the dead or just to act destructively, you're exempt. But tearing to repair is the issue with the measures listed. The minimum measure that you're liable for whitening, disentangling, dyeing, or spinning is a measurement that's about double the width between your stretched apart index and middle finger. For weaving 2 threads, it's the minimum measure of one of those amounts. The Gemara says that the mourning can't be for a relative or a sage, who everybody is like their relative, because tearing your garment for them is an obligation, so it's a constructive act, and you would be liable for that. So, or it's where it's not an upright individual, or you weren't there by the passing. Some say that tearing out of anger is actually constructive, perhaps to satisfy your evil inclination, but we say no, because that's how the evil inclination gets you. First you tear your garments out of anger, then you break utensils out of anger, then you scatter your money out of anger. The principle is that you start off with little things, and they get progressively bigger and bigger until it tells you to perform idolatry and you listen. So rather, it's acting angry, even though you're not actually mad, in order to affect proper behavior from your household. It also says the importance of mourning and eulogizing sages. It also discusses destroying things on Shabbos and how that relates to other forms of working. It also explains measurements of the whitening by the space between fingers. New Mishnah now on the subject of trapping. If you drive a bird into a closet or a deer into a house and shut the door, you're liable. Others include also trapping a deer in this manner in a garden, courtyard, or enclosure. Others say that not all enclosures are the same. The general rule is that if you drive the animal into an enclosure where it's not fully trapped, you're exempt, but if it doesn't require any further trapping, you're liable. The Gemara discusses these laws and classifications. For instance, a small enclosure is defined as where you can reach the animal in a single lunge, or it's where the shadows of the walls reach each other, or it's where there aren't many corners for the animal to escape to, with a large enclosure being what's excluded. It says we hold like the opinion that driving a deer into a small enclosure makes you liable. Furthermore, it says trapping a blind or sleeping deer still makes you liable, as those will run off if they sense a person near, unlike a lame, old, or sick from fatigue deer. In regards to trapping grasshoppers and similar bugs, some say you're liable, some say not, as they aren't usually trapped. Some say you're exempt if they're swarming. Quick little Mishnah: if a deer enters a house by itself and you close the door, you're liable. If 2 people close the door, both are exempt. If the door requires 2 people to close, some say you're liable, some not. The Gemara says an opinion that you're only liable for trapping a lion if it's in a special lion cage. New Mishnah: if the deer is in the house and you sit by the entrance covering half of it, and somebody else sits covering the other half, the second guy is liable. If the first guy blocks the door fully and a second guy comes by, even if the first guy leaves, the first guy is liable and the second person is exempt. This is comparable to a case where you locked your door for safety and it turns out that there was a deer inside, which means you're exempt. The Gemara says a similar case, that if a bird flies into your shirt and can't escape, you're not liable and you can just sit there all day with it. By the way, where the person was fully blocking the door and there happened to be a second guy there too, the second guy was exempt. Now, normally, whenever it says something is exempt in the laws of Shabbos, it means exempt, but still prohibited. This is one of the few exceptions, based on the comparison to the mistakenly locking a deer inside case, where exempt actually means exempt and permitted. The other cases are lancing a boil, not to open it, but only with the intent to remove pus, and the last case, trapping a snake, not for medicinal reasons, but just so that way it doesn't bite you. Those 3 cases are exempt and permissible, and these are sourced from similar rulings. That's the end of chapter 13.